The crack of shattering ceramic echoed across the manicured lawn. "You imbecile!" Mrs. Park's voice cut through the morning air like a whip. "That orchid cost more than your worthless life." The gardener, a hunchbacked man the staff called Mr. Kim, scrambled in the dirt, his calloused hands fumbling to gather the shards of the broken pot. Sorry, ma'am. I didn't see." Mrs. Park's designer heel crunched another fragment into powder. "You don't see. You don't think. You're a waste of space and air." She raised her hand. It never landed. Hannah Ease's fingers wrapped around Mrs. Park's wrist, not rough but firm. The head housekeeper's mouth fell open, her face flushing crimson at the audacity. "Don't." Hannah's voice trembled, but her grip didn't. "Please, take it from my pay. All of it. Just don't touch him." From his position in the dirt, Mr. Kim looked up. His eyes, for just a fraction of a second, weren't the eyes of a simpleton. They were the eyes of a man calculating exactly how many ways a person could die with garden shears. Then he blinked and the moment passed. He returned to his cowering, and no one noticed that his hands, still gathering broken pottery, had stopped shaking entirely. Song Ji-hoon was a name that made district attorneys retire early and entire bloodlines disappear into the Han River. The head of the Seven Dragons Syndicate didn't negotiate, he erased problems. Permanently. But on this sweltering August morning, he was hunched over a flower bed, dirt under his fingernails, listening to a tyrant in a Chanel knockoff scream about proper pruning techniques. The estate sprawled before him, 15 acres of manicured perfection hiding rot underneath. Somewhere in this pristine hell, a mole was selling his secrets. Somewhere in these halls, a traitor was counting down to his assassination. And Song Ji-hoon, the most feared man in Korea, was playing gardener. He'd endured worse. The hunchback prosthetic itched. The fake limp ached after 8 hours. But he'd perfected the shuffle, the downcast eyes, the stuttering apologies that made him invisible. What he hadn't perfected was the rage. Every time Mrs. Park's voice shattered the morning peace, every time her hand struck one of the junior staff, every time she paraded her cruelty like a badge of honor, his fingers twitched toward the pruning shears in his belt. Then Hannah Ease stepped between him and a blow meant for his face. And Song Ji-hoon, who trusted no one and believed in nothing, felt something crack in his chest that had nothing to do with his fake hunchback. She was nobody, a maid drowning in debt, invisible to everyone who mattered. But she'd looked at the pathetic gardener and seen someone worth saving. Foolish girl, he thought, watching her absorb Mrs. Park's fury. You just protected a monster. But he filed her name away in the part of his mind reserved for people who would never be touched. Not by his enemies, not by his world, and certainly not by Mrs. Park. The head housekeeper was still screaming, her face purple with rage, promising to dock Hannah's pay, to make her scrub every toilet in the estate, to ensure she'd regret this insubordination. Ji-hoon kept his head down, his shoulders curved, playing the coward. But his eyes tracked every word, every threat, every cruelty. And in the darkness behind his performance, the dragon began making a list. Before we dive in, understand this. What you're about to hear isn't just a revenge story. It's a lesson in visibility. A maid who was treated like furniture. A tyrant who thought cruelty was leadership. And a lethal predator hiding in plain sight, about to teach them both that the most dangerous person in the room isn't the one screaming. It's the one waiting. Now, if you've been watching stories like this and haven't subscribed yet, trust me, no pressure. But if, by the end of this story, you feel a spark of justice in your chest, if you find yourself cheering for the underdog, if the moment the clumsy gardener stands up straight leaves you with chills, then tap that subscribe button and drop a comment telling me where you're watching from. Because stories like this, they don't just entertain. They remind us that dragons often sleep in the weeds. Alright, let me show you how everything unraveled. 3 weeks ago, Song Ji-hoon had executed a lieutenant with a dessert fork in front of Seoul's elite at a charity gala. The man had stolen $40,000. Pocket change. But betrayal had a price, and Ji-hoon paid it in blood. Now he was tolerating actual weeds. He knelt in the herb garden, his fake hunchback aching, pulling crabgrass with hands that had choked men in designer suits. The countryside estate sprawled around him, his estate purchased through 6 shell companies, meant to be a sanctuary from the city's surveillance. Instead, it had become ground zero for a leak that was bleeding his operations dry. Rival gangs knew his shipment routes. Federal agents raided safe houses hours before drops. Someone in this pristine prison was selling him piece by piece, and Ji-hoon had done what he did best. He disappeared. The 7 dragons thought their boss was in Macau. His enemies thought he was consolidating power in Busan. No one thought to look at the stuttering gardener with dirt under his fingernails. Ji-hoon yanked another weed, imagining it was the mole's throat. He'd narrowed the suspects to 3. The estate manager who handled all external communications, the head of security who knew patrol schedules, and Mrs. Park's nephew who worked in the kitchen and had gambling debts deep enough to drown in. One of them had sold him. One of them would die screaming. But first he had to maintain the performance. Ji-hoon stood, remembering to curve his spine, to let his left leg drag slightly. He'd studied hunchbacks for 2 weeks, the weight distribution, the compensating gait, the way chronic pain changed how a person moved. His physical therapist had called him obsessive. His targets called him thorough. Once, he practiced the shuffle across the garden path, counting steps, perfecting the rhythm. Too smooth and he'd break character. Too exaggerated and he'd draw attention. Invisible. Pathetic. Beneath notice. That's what he needed to be. Mr. Kim. The shrill voice shattered his concentration. Those tomatoes won't stake themselves, you lazy fool. Mrs. Park stood on the terrace, backlit by the afternoon sun, a silhouette of petty tyranny. Ji-hoon ducked his head, mumbled an apology, and shuffled toward the vegetable garden. But his mind was already moving, cataloging, calculating. The estate manager had left the grounds twice this week. Unusual. The head of security had encrypted his phone. Suspicious. The nephew had new shoes. Italian leather. Expensive. One of them was the weed choking his garden. And Song Ji-hoon was very, very good at pulling weeds. Hannah's phone buzzed for the 3rd time during her 15-minute lunch break. She didn't need to look at the screen to know who it was. The debt collectors had her number memorized. She silenced it and returned to scrubbing the baseboards in the East Wing hallway, her knees aching against the marble floor. 6 rooms down. 42 to go. Mrs. Park had decided the entire 2nd floor needed deep cleaning by tomorrow, which meant Hannah would sleep 3 hours tonight if she was lucky. The phone buzzed again. This time she looked. The number was different, but the message was the same. Your mother's treatment is overdue. Payment required immediately or services will be suspended. Hannah's hands tightened around the scrub brush until her knuckles went white. Suspended. Such a clinical word for we'll let her die. She'd picked up every extra shift the estate offered. She'd sold everything she owned except her work uniforms and her mother's wedding ring. She'd skipped meals until her uniform hung loose on her frame. It still wasn't enough. The medical bills were a mountain, and Hannah was drowning in the climb. Movement outside the window caught her eye. The new gardener, Mr. Kim they called him, was struggling with a wheelbarrow full of mulch, his twisted spine making the simple task look agonizing. As she watched, the wheelbarrow tipped, spilling soil across the stone path. Mrs. Park's voice carried from somewhere below. Useless. Can't you do anything right? Hannah saw Mr. Kim flinch, saw him drop to his knees to scoop the dirt with bare hands. His movements frantic and clumsy. Something cracked in her chest. He reminded her of her father in those final months, the way illness had bent his proud frame, The way he'd apologized for needing help, the way the world had treated his weakness as a character flaw rather than a circumstance. Her father had died with $50,000 in medical debt, and a daughter who couldn't save him. Hannah set down her brush and stood, her joints protesting. She had exactly one rice ball left from yesterday's dinner, wrapped in paper in her apron pocket. She'd planned to save it for tonight. But Mr. Kim was out there alone, humiliated, hungry. And Hannah Ease had learned the hard way that sometimes all you can offer someone is the knowledge that they're not invisible. She headed for the garden, the debt collector's message still glowing on her phone screen, unanswered. Some debts you paid in cash. Others you paid in kindness even when you had nothing left to give. The shed behind the greenhouse smelled like fertilizer and old wood, but it was quiet. And for Hannah, quiet was a luxury she couldn't afford anywhere else on the estate. She found Mr. Kim there during the lunch break, sitting on an overturned bucket, his hunchback pressed against the wall. He wasn't eating, just staring at his dirt-stained hands like they belonged to someone else. Mr. Kim, he startled, his head snapping up. For a moment, something sharp flickered in his eyes. Then it vanished, replaced by the familiar watery confusion. Miss Hannah, I was just resting. She pulled the rice ball from her apron and held it out. You should eat. He stared at the offering like she'd handed him a grenade. I can't. That's yours. I already ate. The lie came easily. She'd been telling it for months. Miss Hannah, please. She stepped closer, pressing it into his calloused palm. Mrs. Park works you harder than the rest of us. You need it more. Ji-hoon looked down at the rice ball, barely enough to feed a child, wrapped in paper that had been folded and refolded to preserve every grain. This woman was starving herself and she was trying to feed him. Him. A man who owned restaurants he'd never eaten in. Why? The question escaped before he could stop it. Why do you help me? Hannah settled onto the ground beside his bucket, her back against the shed wall. The exhaustion was written in every line of her face, but her smile was genuine. My father used to say that the world makes us invisible on purpose. It's easier to ignore suffering when you can't see it. She pulled her knees to her chest. But I see you, Mr. Kim. I see how hard you work. How Mrs. Park treats you like you're nothing. She turned to look at him, and Ji-hoon felt something in his chest constrict. We're the people nobody notices, she continued. The ones who clean the floors and trim the hedges and keep everything beautiful for people who'll never know our names. So we have to notice each other. We have to take care of each other. Because we are all we have, Ji-hoon finished quietly. Exactly. He looked at the rice ball in his hand. This tiny, inadequate offering from someone who had nothing. In his world, loyalty was purchased with fear or money. Betrayal was the default. Trust was a weapon waiting to be used against you. But Hannah Ease was sharing her last meal with a stranger because she decided he deserved to be seen. Ji-hoon took a bite. It tasted like salt and shame and something he'd forgotten existed. Tasted like mercy. Thank you, he said, his voice rougher than Mr. Kim's should be. Hannah smiled and closed her eyes, letting the sun warm her face. She had no idea she just fed a dragon. Mrs. Park's diamond brooch went missing on a Tuesday, precisely 3 hours after she'd screamed at Hannah for leaving a water spot on the banister. The entire staff was summoned to the main hall. 17 people lined up like criminals, their faces ranging from confused to terrified. Hannah stood near the end, her apron still damp from scrubbing the conservatory floors. Someone here is a thief, Mrs. Park announced, pacing before them like a general inspecting troops. Her voice dripped with theatrical outrage. My grandmother's brooch. Priceless. Irreplaceable. Gone from my desk drawer. Hannah's stomach dropped. She knew this game. She'd seen Mrs. Park play it before with the cook who'd asked for a day off, with the junior maid who'd talked back. Create a crisis. Assign blame. Eliminate the problem without paying severance. We'll start with a simple inspection, Mrs. Park continued, her smile sharp as broken glass. Empty your pockets. Show me your aprons. One by one the staff complied. Pockets turned out. Aprons shaken. Mrs. Park moved down the line with exaggerated scrutiny, her fingers rifling through their meager belongings like she was searching for state secrets. When she reached Hannah, her eyes gleamed. Your apron, Miss Ease. Hannah untied it with shaking hands and held it out. Mrs. Park snatched it, making a show of checking the pockets, front, back, the small one meant for cleaning rags. Her hand stopped. Well, well. Mrs. Park's voice went soft, dangerous. What do we have here? She pulled the brooch from Hannah's apron pocket, holding it up to catch the light. The diamonds threw rainbows across the horrified faces of the staff. I didn't, Hannah's voice cracked. I've never seen that before. I didn't take it. Of course you didn't. Mrs. Park's sympathy was poison. It just walked into your pocket by itself. Please, Mrs. Park, I swear. Spare me the theatrics. She turned to address the room. Let this be a lesson. Dishonesty will not be tolerated in this household. Hannah's mind raced. Without severance, she'd have nothing. No way to pay this month's medical bills. No way to keep her mother alive. I'll call the police, Mrs. Park continued, examining her nails. Unless you leave immediately. No pay. No reference. Just go. From his position at the back of the line, Mr. Kim watched in silence, his head bowed, his twisted shoulders hunched. But his hands, hidden in his work gloves, were clenched so tight the leather creaked. And behind his downcast eyes, the dragon was calculating exactly how long it would take a human body to sink in the estate's ornamental pond. Mrs. Park wasn't satisfied with simple dismissal. She needed an audience for her cruelty. The kitchen became a courtroom. The staff crowded around the central island while Hannah stood alone near the sink, her face drained of color. The brooch sat on the counter between them like evidence at a murder trial. I've been generous with you people, Mrs. Park began, her voice carrying the practiced cadence of someone who'd rehearsed this speech. I've overlooked tardiness, forgiven mistakes, but theft. She shook her head with theatrical disappointment. Theft is a betrayal of trust. I didn't steal it, Hannah said quietly. Her hands trembled at her sides. Someone put it in my apron. Oh, how convenient. The invisible thief. Mrs. Park's laugh was acid. Tell me, Miss Ease, what did you plan to do with it? Sell it to pay those debts of yours. Hannah's breath hitched. Mrs. Park knew about the medical bills. Of course she did. She probably knew exactly how desperate Hannah was, which made her the perfect target. Ji-hoon stood in the corner near the pantry door, playing his role, shoulders curved, eyes downcast, invisible. But his right hand was buried in his pocket, fingers curled into a fist so tight, his nails drew blood through his work glove. He'd seen interrogations in basement rooms where men begged for mercy. He'd witnessed executions that were kinder than this public humiliation, and he was forcing himself to do nothing. Perhaps we should check her room, one of the senior maids suggested, eager to distance herself from the accused. See what else she's taken. Excellent idea, Mrs. Park purred. That's when Ji-hoon saw it. The estate manager, Lee Sang-min, stood near the doorway, arms crossed, watching the spectacle unfold. And on his face, barely visible, was a smirk. Not surprise. Not concern. Not even the performative shock the others wore. Satisfaction. The kind of expression someone wore when their plan was working perfectly. Ji-hoon's training kicked in. The micro-expressions his interrogators had taught him to read. Lee's eyes kept darting between Mrs. Park and Hannah, then to the hallway beyond, like he was expecting someone, or waiting for something. The pieces clicked into place with brutal clarity. The planted brooch wasn't about Hannah. It was about chaos, distraction, Get the staff focused on internal drama, while Lee conducted his real business, selling Ji-hoon's locations to the highest bidder. And Mrs. Park was his unknowing accomplice. I think we've heard enough, Mrs. Park declared. Miss Ease, you have 1 hour to collect your belongings and… Wait. The word left Ji-hoon's mouth before he could stop it. Every head turned toward the crippled gardener who'd never spoken up in his life. Ji-hoon's heart hammered. He just broke in character. But watching Hannah's devastation, this woman who'd shared her last rice ball with a stranger, he found he didn't care. Ji-hoon waited until 2 a.m., when even Mrs. Park's paranoia slept. He slipped from the servants' quarters without the limp, without the hunch, moving through shadows like he'd been born to them. The estate's security cameras had convenient blind spots. He'd mapped them his second day. Lee Sang-min had been sloppy when installing the system. Arrogant men always were. The groundskeeper's shed sat at the eastern edge of the property, far enough from the main house that sound wouldn't carry. Ji-hoon pulled the burner phone from beneath a loose floorboard and dialed the only number programmed into it. 2 rings. Boss. Status, Ji-hoon said, dropping Mr. Kim's pathetic stutter entirely. His lieutenant Min-jun didn't waste time. Lee Sang-min made contact with the Jade Serpents 3 days ago. Sold them your location, your security detail, everything. We intercepted communications an hour ago. Ji-hoon's jaw tightened. The Jade Serpents. The rivals who'd been nipping at his territory for months, growing bold enough to challenge the 7 dragons directly. When? Tonight. They're sending a crew. Professional. 6 men, maybe 8. Min-jun paused. They think you're vulnerable. Just a crippled gardener and a house full of civilians. How much did Lee get paid? 200,000. Wired to an offshore account yesterday. Ji-hoon closed his eyes. $200,000. The price on his head, paid to a manager who probably made $60,000 a year. Greed made men predictable. The crew is coming to the servants' quarters first, Min-jun continued. They want it to look like a robbery gone wrong. Kill the gardener, maybe a few witnesses, burn the bodies. Hannah's room was in the servants' quarters. 3rd door on the left. Something cold and lethal settled in Ji-hoon's chest. I need you to stay dark, he told Min-jun. No intervention. Let them come. Boss, 6 armed men. I said let them come. Ji-hoon's voice dropped to the register that made grown men weep. I'll handle it. But I need you on standby for cleanup. There's going to be a mess. Silence. Then. Understood. We'll be 10 minutes out. Ji-hoon ended the call and destroyed the phone, grinding it beneath his heel until it was components and dust. Lee Sang-min had made his choice. The Jade Serpents had made theirs. And tonight, in the rain that was already starting to fall, Song Ji-hoon would remind Korea why the 7 dragons didn't have rivals. They had corpses. He walked back to the servants' quarters, his hunchback restored, his shuffle perfect. The dragon was going back to sleep, but only until the wolves arrived. The storm hit at 9 p.m. like God's fist against the earth. Rain hammered the estate's windows and sheets, turning the manicured lawns into rivers. Lightning fractured the sky, each flash illuminating the countryside in stark white before plunging it back into darkness. Then the power died. The main house went black. Emergency lighting kicked in for 30 seconds before that failed too, leaving only the storm's intermittent lightning to see by. Incompetent fools. Mrs. Park's voice shrilled from somewhere in the darkness. Someone fix this immediately. Hannah fumbled for the flashlight in the supply closet, her hands shaking. Not from the storm. She'd grown up with worse weather in Lagos. But something felt wrong tonight. The air was too heavy, too charged, like the moment before a bomb detonates. Miss Ease. Mrs. Park appeared in the beam of Hannah's flashlight, her face twisted with fury. The breaker box is in the utility shed. Go reset it. Hannah looked toward the windows. The storm was a living wall of water and wind. "Mrs. Park, it's dangerous out there. I don't pay you to make excuses. Go. Now." Hannah pulled on her rain jacket, her stomach churning with dread. The utility shed was 100 yards from the house, across open ground that would be mud and lightning by now. She was reaching for the door handle when a hand caught her wrist. Mr. Kim stood behind her, water already dripping from his hair like he'd been outside. His grip was firm, not the trembling touch of a frightened gardener but something harder. Final. "Don't," he said quietly. Mrs. Park rounded on him. "How dare you? Stay inside." Ji-hoon's voice cut through her outrage like a blade. "All of you. Lock the doors. Don't open them for anyone." Hannah stared at him. His posture had changed. The hunch was still there, but something in his spine had straightened. His eyes, usually downcast and watery, were sharp as broken glass. "Mr. Kim, what?" Thunder cracked so loud the windows rattled. In the flash of lightning that followed, Hannah saw something that stopped her breath. 3 figures moving across the lawn toward the house. Not running from the storm, running through it. With purpose. Ji-hoon released her wrist and moved to the window, his limp suddenly impossibly gone. "Get away from the doors," he said, and this time it wasn't a request. It was a command from someone accustomed to being obeyed. Outside, the figures drew closer, and Song Ji-hoon cracked his neck, the sound audible even over the storm, and smiled. The first mercenary came through the kitchen window in an explosion of glass and rain. He hit the floor, rolling assault rifle already raised, scanning for targets. 2 more followed through the shattered frame, moving with military precision, black tactical gear, faces covered, weapons that weren't for show. The staff screamed. Some ran. Others froze. Mrs. Park pressed herself against the wall, her earlier bravado evaporating like steam. "Money's in the safe," she shrieked. "First floor study, behind the painting." The lead mercenary ignored her. His eyes swept the room, cataloging faces, searching. "Where's the gardener?" His voice was flat, professional. Korean accent, but trained somewhere foreign. "Kim. The hunchback. Where is he?" Hannah's blood turned to ice. They weren't here to rob the estate. They were here for Mr. Kim. I don't know," someone stammered. "He was just here." "Find him." The mercenary gestured to his team. "Check the servants' quarters. If anyone moves, put them down." 2 men peeled off toward the hallway. The third stayed in the kitchen, his rifle trained on the huddled staff. Mrs. Park's survival instincts kicked in with the speed of a rat abandoning a sinking ship. "Wait." She pushed forward, pointing directly at Hannah. "Her. She knows where he is. She's always with him, feeding him, protecting him like some kind of dog." Hannah's breath caught. "Mrs. Park. They're probably hiding together right now." Mrs. Park's voice climbed higher, desperate. "She knows everything about this house. Make her talk. Just don't hurt the rest of us." The mercenary's attention swung to Hannah like a searchlight. He crossed the kitchen in 3 strides and grabbed her arm, dragging her toward the center of the room. "Where is he?" "I don't know what you're." He backhanded her. The crack echoed. Hannah tasted copper. "Where is he?" Through the ringing in her ears, Hannah heard Mrs. Park. "Check her room. She probably hid him there." The mercenary nodded to his partner. "Do it. And if the girl's lying." "She's not lying." The voice came from the pantry doorway. Mr. Kim stepped into the light, his shoulders no longer hunched, his spine straight as a blade. "I'm right here." The mercenary spun, raising his weapon. But Ji-hoon was already moving, and the gardener who'd cowered for weeks had vanished entirely. What remained was a dragon, and dragons don't bow to wolves. The mercenary's rifle was still rising when Ji-hoon closed the distance. 3 steps. Faster than thought. His hand, calloused from weeks of actual gardening, caught the barrel and twisted. Bone snapped. The mercenary's trigger finger bent backward at an angle fingers weren't meant to bend, and his scream died as Ji-hoon's elbow caved in his throat. The body hit the floor before anyone could blink. The second mercenary fired. Bullets punched through the space Ji-hoon had occupied a heartbeat earlier. He'd already moved, fluid as water, and his hand found the pruning shears on the counter. One throw. Surgical precision. The shears buried themselves in the mercenary's eye socket. He dropped like a puppet with cut strings. The third man, the one who'd hit Hannah, released her and swung his rifle around. Too slow. Ji-hoon grabbed a cast-iron skillet from the stove and brought it across the man's jaw with enough force to shatter teeth. The mercenary staggered. Ji-hoon followed with a knee to the solar plexus, driving the air from his lungs, then caught his head and slammed it against the kitchen island. Once, twice, 3 times. The granite cracked before the skull did. Silence fell like a curtain. Ji-hoon stood in the center of the kitchen, breathing steady, surrounded by corpses and terrified witnesses. His spine was straight. His shoulders were broad. The hunchback prosthetic hung askew, partially torn free during the violence. He reached up and ripped it off completely, letting it fall to the blood-slicked floor. Mrs. Park made a sound like a dying animal. You. Her voice was barely a whisper. You're not. No. Ji-hoon's voice was different now, cold, cultured, carrying the weight of absolute authority. I'm not. Footsteps thundered from the hallway. The other 2 mercenaries, returning at the sound of gunfire. They appeared in the doorway, weapons raised, and froze. Their target, the helpless gardener they'd been sent to execute, stood waiting for them. His shirt was torn. His fake limp was gone. And his eyes held the kind of emptiness that came from killing so many people that 3 more barely registered. Ji-hoon picked up the first mercenary's rifle, checked the magazine with practiced ease, and smiled. Your turn. They died before they could retreat. When the echoes faded, Ji-hoon set down the rifle and looked at Hannah. She sat against the wall where she'd fallen, her hand pressed to her bleeding mouth, staring at him like he'd become a stranger. I'm sorry you had to see that, he said quietly. Outside, the storm raged. Inside, the dragon had woken, and there were still debts to collect. The silence after violence was always the loudest. Ji-hoon pulled a dish towel from the counter and wiped blood from his face. Some his, most not. His hands were steady. They always were after killing. It was the waiting before that made them shake. Around him, the staff remained frozen, their minds struggling to reconcile the cowering gardener with the man who just dismantled 6 trained killers like they were weeds in his garden. Hannah hadn't moved. She sat against the wall, her dark eyes tracking his every movement, fear and confusion warring across her face. That look hurt worse than any bullet. Headlights swept across the windows. 3 black SUVs rolled up the circular drive, their engines purring like predatory cats. The vehicles stopped in perfect formation, and men in dark suits emerged, ignoring the rain. 8 of them, moving with military discipline. They entered through the shattered kitchen window, stepping over bodies without flinching, and formed 2 lines. Then as one they bowed. Deep, reverent, the kind of bow reserved for emperors. Boss, Min-jun said, his head still lowered. We came as soon as we heard shots. Are you injured? I'm fine. Ji-hoon's voice carried the casual authority of someone accustomed to commanding killers. Secure the estate. Find Lee Sang-min. Alive. Yes, boss. The lieutenants dispersed like shadows, weapons drawn, moving through the house with practiced efficiency. Mrs. Park made a strangled sound. Ji-hoon turned to face her, and she stumbled backward, her designer shoes slipping in blood. Her mind couldn't complete the sentence. The pathetic gardener. The man she'd screamed at, humiliated, worked like an animal. Song Ji-hoon, he finished for her. Head of the 7 dragons. Owner of this estate. He stepped closer, and she pressed herself against the wall. And the man whose employee you've been torturing for 3 weeks. Mrs. Park's face went white. I didn't know, I never, please. You planted evidence on Hannah E's. His voice was quiet, conversational, terrifying in its calm. You were going to destroy her life over a brooch you hid yourself. For what? Entertainment. It was just. Just what? Ji-hoon cocked his head. Just a maid? Just someone powerless? Just someone who didn't matter? Mrs. Park's knees gave out. She collapsed to the floor, hands clasped like prayer. Please. I have a family. I'll do anything. So does she. Ji-hoon gestured toward Hannah. A sick mother dying because she can't afford treatment. But you knew that, didn't you? That's why you chose her. Min-jun returned, dragging Lee Sang-min by the collar. The estate manager's face was already swelling from the persuasion required to find him. Ji-hoon looked at the 2 people who'd made his investigation necessary. Take them both, he said. Mrs. Park is fired. Lee requires deeper conversation. His lieutenant smiled. It wasn't pleasant. 2 weeks later, Hannah's phone stopped ringing. The debt collectors who'd haunted her for 18 months went silent. When she called the hospital in panic, terrified they'd discontinued her mother's treatment, the billing department told her the account had been paid in full. Anonymous donor. Electronic transfer. Every cent, including future care for the next 2 years. Hannah had cried in the supply closet for 20 minutes. Mrs. Park had vanished the night of the attack. The official story was immediate termination and severance, generous enough to buy silence. The unofficial story, whispered among staff who'd seen too much, was that she'd been escorted off the property by men in dark suits and was last seen boarding a flight to Singapore with a one-way ticket and a warning never to return to Korea. Lee Sang-min's disappearance made the news. Estate manager gone missing. Police investigating. No leads. The staff who remained didn't ask questions. They'd learned that ignorance was survival. Hannah had tried to avoid Mr. Kim, or whoever he really was, but the estate wasn't large enough for ghosts. She'd seen him twice, always at a distance, always watching her with an expression she couldn't read. Then the summons came. Miss E's, you're wanted in the main office. Her hands shook as she climbed the stairs to the wing where servants never went. This was it. She'd seen too much. Knew too much. Anonymous generosity didn't erase the fact that she was a witness to mass murder. The office door was open. Song Ji-hoon sat behind an oak desk, wearing a tailored charcoal suit that probably cost more than Hannah made in a year. His hair was styled. His posture was perfect. He looked like what he was, dangerous, wealthy, untouchable. Nothing like the gardener who'd shared her rice balls. Sit, he said, gesturing to the chair across from him. Hannah sat, her spine rigid, prepared for the worst. I'm shutting down most of the estate operations, Ji-hoon began. Skeleton staff only. Security. Groundskeeping. One house manager to oversee it all. Here it comes, Hannah thought. The polite dismissal. I want you to be that manager. Her brain stalled. I what? The estate needs someone who understands that the people who work here are human beings, not furniture. His voice was calm, businesslike. Someone who leads with compassion instead of cruelty. Someone who sees the invisible. Mr. Song, I'm just a maid. You're the woman who protected a stranger when you had everything to lose. Ji-hoon leaned forward. You're the only person in this entire operation I trust. Hannah's throat tightened. Why? Because you shared your last meal with someone you thought was nobody. He smiled, small, genuine. Nothing like the predator from that bloody kitchen. Turns out, kindness is the rarest currency in my world. He slid a contract across the desk. The salary is fair. Your mother's medical care is covered separately. You'll have full authority over staff and operations. I'm rarely here, so the estate is yours to run. He paused. With kindness. Hannah looked at the contract. At the man who'd killed 6 people to protect her. At the second chance she'd never expected. One condition, she said quietly. Ji-hoon raised an eyebrow. No more disguises. If you're here as yourself. Something flickered in his eyes, surprise, maybe respect. Deal. Hannah picked up the pen and signed. Outside, the gardens bloomed. Inside, the dragon had finally found his sanctuary. And the invisible girl had become the lady of the house. Sometimes the quietest act of kindness echoes louder than a gunshot. And the person you refuse to see is the only one who can save you. Thanks for watching, and remember to subscribe for more incredible true stories that prove humanity still exists in the darkest places.